"Look at this photo," Sarah whispered, her hand trembling as she held the wedding album. Her voice broke the silence of the dusty photo studio where I'd been sorting through decades of forgotten memories. I should have never agreed to help clean out my uncle's photography business after his sudden passing. The musty smell of old film chemicals and fading paper hung in the air like ghosts of celebrations long past. Uncle Marcus had been the town's premier wedding photographer for 40 years, capturing thousands of couples' happiest moments before retiring 5 years ago due to his failing eyesight. The studio felt frozen in time. Vintage cameras lined the shelves, rolls of undeveloped film sat in metal canisters, and countless photo albums were stacked in towering piles throughout the cramped space. Sarah, my cousin and Marcus's only daughter, had been going through his wedding portfolios when she found it. "What's wrong?" I asked, moving closer to see what had drained the color from her face. She was staring at a photograph from what appeared to be an elegant outdoor wedding ceremony. The bride and groom stood beneath a flowering archway, surrounded by smiling guests in their finest attire. Sunlight filtered through the trees, creating a dreamy, romantic atmosphere that Marcus was famous for capturing. But Sarah wasn't looking at the happy couple. Her finger pointed to something in the background, barely visible unless you knew where to look. "Tell me you see it too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned in closer, squinting at the image. At first, everything seemed normal. Typical wedding guests, beautiful decorations, the kind of perfect moment that made Marcus's reputation. Then I saw it. In the reflection of a crystal vase placed on a nearby table, there was something that shouldn't have been there. Have you ever found something in an old photo that made your blood run cold? Share your story in the comments and make sure to subscribe, because what we discovered next changed everything we thought we knew about that perfect wedding day. The reflection showed a figure standing just outside the frame of the main photograph. But this wasn't just any wedding guest who happened to be caught in the crystal's surface. This was someone who, according to the wedding date written on the back of the photo, should have been impossible to capture. This photo was taken in June 1987, Sarah said, her voice shaking as she read the date written in Marcus's careful handwriting on the back. The Morrison Webb wedding at Riverside Gardens. I remembered hearing about that wedding. It had been one of the most elaborate ceremonies in our small town's history. The bride's family had spared no expense, flying in flowers from 3 states away and hiring a string quartet. Marcus had talked about it for years afterward, calling it one of his finest works. But now, staring at that crystal vase reflection, something was terribly wrong. The figure in the background was clear enough to make out distinct features, an elderly man in a dark suit, standing perfectly still while everyone else seemed to be in motion. His face was turned slightly toward the camera, and even in the distorted reflection, his expression appeared unnaturally calm, almost serene. "Do you recognize him?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Sarah's hands were shaking as she reached for another album. "I need to show you something else," she said, flipping through pages of family photos until she found what she was looking for. It was a formal portrait from the 1960s, a family gathering at Christmas. She pointed to a man standing in the back row. My heart stopped. It was the same face from the wedding reflection, unchanged by time. The same penetrating eyes, the same slight smile, the same way of standing with his hands clasped behind his back. "This is my grandfather, Thomas Morrison," Sarah whispered. "The bride's grandfather. He died 3 months before that wedding. I was at his funeral. We all were." The room suddenly felt colder. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the studio windows seemed to dim, casting long shadows across the scattered photographs. I found myself looking over my shoulder, as if expecting to see that same figure standing behind us. But the implications were just beginning to sink in. If Thomas Morrison had died months before his granddaughter's wedding, how could he appear so clearly in Marcus's photograph? Had my uncle somehow manipulated the image? But this was 1987. Long before digital photography and Photoshop, Marcus worked exclusively with film, developing everything by hand in his darkroom. "There has to be an explanation," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Deep down, I was beginning to realize that some discoveries change everything you thought you knew about the world. Sarah disappeared into the back room and returned with 3 more wedding albums, her face pale as moonlight. "I started looking through other weddings after finding that photo," she said, spreading the albums across the cluttered desk. "I needed to know if this was isolated." The first album she opened was from a spring wedding in 1989. The ceremony had taken place in the town's historic church, with reception photos at the country club afterward. Marcus had captured every moment beautifully. The bride's tears of joy, the groom's nervous smile, the flower girl's adorable stumble down the aisle. "Look at this one," Sarah said, pointing to a reception photo. The bride and groom were cutting their cake, while guests applauded in the background. But there, reflected in the silver cake knife, was an impossible face. I felt my stomach drop. It was an elderly woman in a lace dress, smiling gently at the happy couple. But according to Sarah's research, this was the groom's grandmother, who had passed away the previous winter. The family had placed her favorite flowers at her empty chair during the ceremony as a tribute. Yet here she was, somehow present in the reflection, watching her grandson's special day. The second album revealed another impossibility. A summer wedding from 1992, where the reflection in a champagne glass showed a middle-aged man in a military uniform. Sarah had called the bride's family to inquire. It was the bride's father, a Vietnam veteran who had died in a car accident 6 months before walking his daughter down the aisle. "Every wedding album," Sarah whispered, opening the third collection. "Every single one has at least one impossible guest. Always in reflections, mirrors, glasses, picture frames, jewelry, anything that could catch and hold an image." The evidence was undeniable. For decades, Marcus had been unknowingly documenting the impossible. Deceased family members appearing at weddings they couldn't attend, captured only in reflections, as if they were standing just outside our visible world, watching their loved ones celebrate life's most precious moments. But the most disturbing realization was yet to come. As we continued examining the photographs, a pattern emerged that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The impossible guests weren't random appearances. They were all connected to the families being photographed, and they all shared one unsettling characteristic that would soon reveal the true nature of what Marcus had been capturing all those years. "They're all looking directly at the camera," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "Every single impossible guest." Sarah nodded grimly, confirming what we'd both begun to notice. In every reflection, the deceased family members weren't simply present at the weddings. They were acknowledging Marcus's camera, their eyes meeting his lens through mirrors, champagne flutes, and polished surfaces. It was as if they knew they were being photographed. But that wasn't the most unsettling discovery. As we continued our investigation, Sarah found Marcus's old appointment books, leather-bound journals, where he meticulously recorded details about each wedding. Alongside the standard information, dates, locations, family contacts, he had begun making strange notations in the margins. "Listen to this," Sarah said, reading from his 1987 entries. "Morrison Webb wedding. Unusual cold spot near the garden archway. Film camera malfunctioned twice during ceremony. Bride's grandmother mentioned feeling watched during reception." The entries became more detailed over the years. Marcus had started documenting unexplained phenomena at his wedding shoots. Sudden temperature drops, camera equipment failures, guests reporting the sensation of being observed by unseen presences. He'd begun carrying multiple cameras, paranoid about missing crucial shots due to technical difficulties that seemed to plague certain ceremonies. "Here's something from 1994, Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "The deceased seemed drawn to moments of joy, They appear strongest in reflections during the most emotional parts of the ceremony, the vows, the first dance, the cutting of the cake, as if love itself calls them back. The revelation sent chills through me. Marcus hadn't just been accidentally capturing these impossible guests. He'd been aware of their presence for years. The question that haunted me was why he'd never told anyone. Why he'd continued photographing weddings, knowing that each celebration was attended by the dead. The answer lay in his final journal entry, dated just weeks before his retirement. Sarah read it aloud, and her voice broke as she spoke the words that would change our understanding of everything. I've decided to stop. The weight of seeing them, knowing they're there but being unable to tell the families, has become unbearable. How do you tell a bride that her father, who died the year before, is standing behind her during her first dance? How do you explain to a groom that his beloved grandmother is weeping tears of joy in the reflection of his wedding ring? But as unsettling as these revelations were, we were about to discover that Marcus's story didn't end with his retirement. Hidden in the deepest drawer of his desk was a final album, one that contained photographs he'd never shown to any client, and for good reason. The album was bound in black leather, unmarked and hidden beneath stacks of invoices and old receipts. When Sarah pulled it from the drawer, dust motes danced in the afternoon light like tiny spirits celebrating their discovery. The leather was warm to the touch, as if it had been recently handled, though we knew Marcus had been gone for 2 weeks. "I've never seen this before," Sarah whispered as she opened the cover. The first page contained a handwritten note in Marcus's careful script. "For those who come after me, the truth about what I've seen." What followed were dozens of photographs unlike anything in his professional portfolios. These weren't wedding shots or family portraits. They were images of empty rooms, vacant churches, abandoned reception halls, all taken after the celebrations had ended. But in every reflection, every mirror, every polished surface, the impossible guests remained. The first photograph showed the Morrison wedding venue the day after the ceremony. The gardens were empty, chairs stacked, decorations removed. But in the crystal vase that had revealed Thomas Morrison's presence, his reflection was still there, clearer now, more defined. He stood in the same position, but his expression had changed. Where before he had looked serene, now his face showed something that looked almost like longing. He went back, I realized, my voice barely a whisper. Marcus went back to the venues after the weddings. Page after page revealed the same phenomenon. The deceased family members didn't disappear when the celebrations ended. They lingered in the reflective surfaces, trapped or perhaps choosing to remain in the places where they'd watched their loved ones' happiness unfold. Some appeared clearer in these follow-up photographs, as if the absence of the living allowed them to manifest more fully. But the most disturbing images were at the back of the album. These showed Marcus's own home, his personal mirrors and windows, and in every reflection stood figures he didn't recognize, strangers in period clothing from different eras, all watching him with the same knowing expressions we'd seen in the wedding photographs. "They followed him home," Sarah said, her voice hollow with realization. "All those years of photographing them, and they started following him." The final photograph in the album was dated just 1 week before Marcus's death. It showed his bedroom mirror at night, illuminated only by moonlight streaming through the window, but the reflection showed dozens of figures crowded behind his bed, a gathering of all the impossible guests he'd captured over the decades. And there, in the center of the crowd, was a figure we both recognized with dawning horror. It was Marcus himself, standing among the dead, as if he'd already joined their silent assembly. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned to the very last page of the secret album. There, clipped to the inside back cover, was a manila envelope marked, "Final roll, do not develop until after." The envelope was sealed, but we could feel the weight of undeveloped film inside. "He knew," I said, the realization settling over me like a shroud. Somehow he knew what was coming. We found the key to Marcus's darkroom hanging on a nail behind his desk, exactly where Sarah remembered it from childhood visits. The dark room was cramped and windowless, smelling of chemicals and time. Red light bulbs cast everything in an otherworldly glow, making our shadows dance on the walls like the very spirits we'd been discovering in his photographs. With practiced hands that remembered countless hours helping Marcus develop film, Sarah began the process of bringing that final roll to life. The familiar sounds of running water and chemical baths filled the silence, but there was something different about this development session. Something that felt more like a séance than photography. The first images to emerge in the developer were heartbreaking. They showed Marcus's last wedding shoot, the Peterson ceremony from 3 weeks before his death, but these weren't the polished, professional shots he'd given to the family. These were the outtakes, the moments between poses when his subjects weren't looking. In every single photograph, Marcus had captured something the family never saw. The bride's late mother stood behind her during the dress fitting, her translucent hands adjusting the veil. The groom's deceased brother sat in an empty chair during the ceremony, applauding silently during the kiss. An elderly couple, gone for years, danced together in the background of the reception photos, their joy radiating even through the veil of death. But the final photographs on the roll were different. These weren't wedding shots at all. They were self-portraits, taken by Marcus in his own home using a timer. In the first few, he appeared alone, looking tired and sad. But as the sequence progressed, the reflective surfaces around him began to fill with figures. The last photograph stopped our hearts. It showed Marcus sitting in his favorite chair, looking directly at the camera with an expression of peaceful acceptance. But surrounding him in every mirror, every picture frame, every polished surface in the room were hundreds of figures, all the impossible guests from 40 years of wedding photography. And Marcus was no longer alone in the physical world. Standing behind his chair, with her hand gently placed on his shoulder, was his beloved wife Eleanor, who had died 10 years earlier. The chemicals seemed to whisper secrets as the final image fully developed before our eyes. Eleanor's face was unmistakable, the same warm smile that had graced their own wedding photos 50 years earlier, the same loving gaze she'd given Marcus throughout their life together. But seeing her there, solid and present behind her husband's chair, shattered everything we thought we understood about life and death. Sarah collapsed into Marcus's old chair, the weight of discovery crushing her spirit. "He wasn't sick," she said, her voice hollow. "The doctor said his heart just stopped. No warning, no symptoms. He went to sleep and never woke up." But now we understood. Marcus hadn't died of natural causes. He had been called home. I picked up his final journal from the darkroom shelf, one we hadn't noticed before. The last entry was dated the night before his death. "Eleanor came to me in the mirror tonight. She's been waiting," she said, "waiting for me to finish my work here. All these years, I thought I was capturing ghosts by accident, but now I understand. Love doesn't die. It just moves to a different wavelength, one that cameras can sometimes detect. The bereaved call them back to witness their joy, and we photographers are simply the conduits between worlds. Tomorrow, I'll put down my camera for the last time. Eleanor says the others are waiting for me, all the impossible guests I've captured over the years. They want to thank me for helping them stay connected to their family's precious moments. I'm not afraid anymore. Death isn't an ending. It's just a change of perspective." The revelation hit us like a physical force. Marcus hadn't been haunted by the dead. He'd been chosen by them. His gift for capturing impossible guests wasn't an accident of light and reflection, but a sacred calling that had allowed him to document love's triumph over death itself. But as we stood in that red-lit darkroom, surrounded by 40 years of impossible photographs, a new terror began to take hold. If Marcus had been called to join Eleanor and the others, if his death had been a reunion rather than an ending, then what did that mean for us? We weren't just his relatives cleaning out a photography studio. We were witnesses to something that should have remained hidden. We had seen too much, learned too much about the thin veil between worlds, and as that realization settled over us, we heard the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter clicking somewhere in the darkness behind us. The sound came again, click, 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 mechanical and precise, like Marcus's old medium-format camera. But we were alone in the darkroom, and all of his cameras were stored in the main studio. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin as we stood frozen in the red light, listening to the impossible sounds of photography happening in the darkness around us. Then we saw it. In the reflection of the developer tray's stainless steel surface, Marcus stood behind us, camera in hand, that same peaceful expression from his final self-portrait. But he wasn't alone. Eleanor stood beside him, along with dozens of other figures. All the impossible guests he'd captured over the decades, now watching us with knowing smiles. "He's still working," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with wonder rather than fear. "Even now, he's still documenting love." The clicking stopped, and the figures in the reflection began to fade, but not before Marcus raised his hand in a gentle wave, the same gesture he'd used to signal the end of every photo session throughout his career. Eleanor blew us a kiss, and then they were gone, leaving only our own terrified faces staring back from the developer tray. We found ourselves back in the main studio, though neither of us remembered leaving the darkroom. On Marcus's desk sat a fresh photograph that hadn't been there before, a picture of Sarah and me in the darkroom, looking at his impossible wedding images. But in every reflective surface visible in the photograph, Marcus stood behind us, still watching over his life's work. Attached to the photo was a note in his familiar handwriting. "The camera sees what the heart knows to be true. Love never dies, it just changes form. Continue the work." That was 6 months ago. Sarah and I reopened the studio, and we've been photographing weddings ever since. We use Marcus's old cameras and develop the film in his darkroom, following the same techniques he taught us years ago. And yes, we still capture impossible guests. But now we understand what we're really doing. We're not just photographers, we're witnesses to love's eternal nature, documenting the truth that families sense but cannot see. When a bride feels her late father's presence walking her down the aisle, when a groom senses his grandmother's approval during his vows, they're not imagining things. They're there, in the reflections, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the love that transcends death itself. I still keep that first photograph, the Morrison Webb wedding with Thomas Morrison's impossible reflection. But I can look at it now without fear, because I understand what Marcus spent 40 years learning. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but witnessed. And sometimes late at night in the darkroom, when the red light casts everything in that otherworldly glow, I see Marcus in the developer tray's reflection, still working, still documenting the impossible, still proving that love is the one force that can cross any boundary, even death itself. The camera never lies. It simply shows us what we're too afraid to see with our own eyes.